When a black person gets stopped by law enforcement, we are at a higher risk of being involved in a fatal incident than any other group in America. What's worse, if our actions during the encounter, innocent or otherwise, are misinterpreted, the chances of us being killed increase dramatically. Being stopped for no legal reason is one thing, but if you're rolling dirty and you get stopped by the cops, you're already at a disadvantage. In either case, the question becomes, what are you prepared to do if the encounter goes wrong? I'm going to give you a few things to consider that can help you stay alive. But before I do, let's talk a little bit about something called the force continuum and the role it can play in your contact with law enforcement. One of the factors that can determine whether or not an officer's actions were appropriate or inappropriate during contact with a subject is how closely they followed what is called the use of force continuum. The use of force continuum is a standard that provides law enforcement officers and civilians with guidelines as to how much force may be used against a resisting subject in a given situation. This is more commonly referred to in law enforcement circles as the appropriate force necessary to make the arrest or to stop the subject from doing what he is doing. If an officer applies more force than is necessary to make the arrest, or worse, continues to apply force after a subject is subdued, police misconduct occurs. The level of force used by the officer can be escalated or de-escalated at the officer's discretion and without notice, as long as it legally fits the situation. If a subject is obedient, compliant, and non-aggressive, there is no force required on the part of the officer. If the subject is resisting and non-compliant, the officer can escalate the use of force to legal physical control holds or OC spray. If the subject becomes physically aggressive or combative, the officer may escalate the use of force to tasers or a baton to subdue the subject. If an officer believes there's an imminent threat of loss of life or serious bodily injury, he is authorized to use deadly force. As I said earlier, it is at the officer's discretion to de-escalate or escalate the use of force, depending on the threat level of the situation. The use of force continuum in and of itself is not a bad thing. But when certain members of the law enforcement community choose to exceed the necessary level of force to control a situation, it can have tragic results, particularly in the black community. But the results don't always have to be tragic. If you can keep your head, don't escalate the situation, and remember a few things that I'm about to tell you. A good indication of how your encounter with a police officer is going to go is the attitude, demeanor, and tone of the police officer during the contact. A police officer doesn't necessarily have to be friendly, but he or she does have to be professional and respectful. Anything less than that is a problem. That means that your encounter could go bad at any given moment, and that you should be prepared to de-escalate the situation in any way that you can. But before we get into some de-escalation strategies, let's talk about some deadly force escalators that you should avoid. Deadly force escalators are words and actions that increase your chances of being a victim of physical violence or deadly force. They can cause an officer to immediately jump to the top of the use of force continuum. Deadly force escalators can cause an officer to respond to your actions with the use of deadly force, whether justified or not. Simply put, these are actions that you might consider taking that can get you killed. They usually fall under 4 different actions: reaching, refusing, resisting, or running. Let's take a look at each one. Reaching is generally any movement you make to retrieve a certain object from your person, such as your identification, or a vehicle, such as your registration. You should be extremely careful when reaching for any item, even if you're being directed by an officer to do so. You should always move very slowly and tell the officer what you are doing each step of the way. You don't want your movements to be misinterpreted as threatening, or an item to be misidentified as a weapon. If you don't feel comfortable retrieving the item yourself, especially at night, inform the officer of your concerns and have them do it. You don't want to be a victim of an easily frightened cop, as was the case with Philando Castillo, who was killed by a cowardly officer while following his instructions to retrieve his identification. You should always play it safe and reduce the opportunity for a cop to overreact in a reaching situation. The next deadly force escalator that you should be aware of is refusing. Refusing occurs when a person is given a direct order by an officer, unlawful or otherwise, and they refuse to comply. When this happens, the officer can become physically aggressive, which can lead to resisting and or running on the part of the detained party. Neither refusing, resisting, or running can have positive outcomes, and they can result in serious bodily injury, as was the case with Jacob Blake, who was shot 7 times in the back after he refused to drop a knife and attempted to enter a vehicle. Although he survived the shooting, he is now paralyzed from the waist down. This is an extremely high price to pay for refusing to follow an officer's command. When you physically resist an officer, this not only brings aggressive physical contact, it also opens the door for multiple officers to put hands on you and automatically gives them a possible defense for any action that they may take to control you and the situation. It also opens the door for deadly force mistakes made on the part of the officer, as was the case with Daunte Wright, who was shot and killed by an officer who mistook her pistol for a taser. The chances of a fatal mistake like this one increase tremendously when you physically resist. Finally, we come to running, the deadly force escalator that has resulted in more deaths than any other. Whether running on foot or in a motor vehicle, your chances of being killed while being pursued by law enforcement increase tremendously. This is the only deadly force escalator that can involve other elements outside of law enforcement, such as trees and other vehicles, which can cause death or serious bodily injury. There have been multiple incidents of unarmed people being shot and killed while fleeing from the police, as was the case with Walter Scott, who was shot in the back multiple times as he ran away from an officer, even though he was unarmed. I hope these tips will prove helpful and useful to you if and when you have an encounter with law enforcement. The bottom line is this: don't reach, refuse, resist, or run, which will reduce your odds of becoming another tragic victim. If you want to stay up to date on matters that affect the personal safety of our community, make sure that you like and subscribe to this channel.